A Renaissance in Harlem and Paris. The Great Migration in the World War I era. Isabel Wilkerson, the first Black woman to win a Pulitzer Prize in journalism, wrote that the millions of African Americans who migrated from the Jim Crow South to the urban North and West after emancipation, quote, did what human beings looking for freedom throughout history have often done. They left. Migration, movement, captivity, and travel are central to the history of the African diaspora in North America and conceptions of freedom and protest in the United States. They're also central to the rise, creation, and circulation of Black popular culture and how it spread globally. Richard Wright, the famed author of Native Son and Black Boy, handwrote a poem in his journal reflecting his own motivations for leaving his plantation in Natchez, Mississippi, where he was born in 1908, to go to Chicago in 1927. He headed north 2 years earlier during the great stock market crash of 1929, and Wright would live and work in Chicago, New York, and then, ultimately, like many Black artists and writers of his generation, he left the United States entirely for Paris. And the topic of the History 400 seminar that I teach details that exact migration of African Americans sojourning to Paris. And so the poem that he wrote in his diary that Isabel Wilkerson uses to get the name of her famous book is as follows. I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant an alien soil, to see if I could grow differently, if I could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom. He reminisced of his decision to risk leaving all that he knew, just as fugitive slaves had done in the century before him. I headed north full of a hazy notion that life could be lived with dignity, that the personalities of others should not be violated, that men should be able to confront other men without fear or shame, or that if men were lucky in their living on earth, they might win some redeeming meaning for having struggled and suffered here beneath the stars. The 1920s witnessed an extraordinary amount of internal migration. Americans were on the move and their destinations were discernible. Some 6 million Americans moved from farms to cities. More than 2 million Americans moved to California. Most of them were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. But today, we're going to talk about this Great Migration. The Great Migration saw Black Americans leaving the South in unprecedented numbers between 1915 and 1970. The idea grew, particularly among a new generation of Black Americans who had never known enslavement except through the stories told to them by their parents and grandparents. When W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous sociologist, described the, quote, Southern freedmen's sons and daughters, end quote, he was describing not only a generation by age between the former slaves and the post-slave generations, but important differences in temperament, outlook, and risk. The new generation aspired to be something beyond what their parents and grandparents were either willing to settle for or were completely economically re-enslaved to through abusive sharecropping. Freedmen's children knew that the conditions in the South would never get better, that the opportunities for, quote, making it were virtually non-existent, that the South's entire racial system, not simply Jim Crow, not simply lynchings, not simply debt peonage, not simply sexual violence, not simply inferior schools and medical care for children and elderly who were all expected to labor, but the essence of the entire racial system had become intolerable. The heated racial violence, the lynchings, the beatings, the humiliation of being called son or being called boy, having to smile, having to, quote, wear the mask, as it was called, and yes, ma'am, and yes, sir, in the escalation of riots. And there were many riots. The difference being that race riots in the late 19th and early 20th century were different from how we understand them today. They normally began by a white race mob going into black residential districts. The Wilmington race riot of 1898, the Atlanta race riot of 1906, the Omaha race riot of 1919, the Chicago race riot of 1919, the pogrom in Tulsa was too much to endure. Working in the South was no longer a matter of diminished returns, but of no returns at all. And if the North prior to 1915 offered no real alternative, that was no longer true with the industrial mobilization for World War I. Suddenly, with white male workers leaving to go to fight in Europe en masse, there were opportunities in the North. The industry, fed by wartime demands, opened up. Opportunities in plants to make ships, automobiles for Henry Ford, airplanes, assembly lines, all to fight Europe, both for Americans and African Americans. The decision to leave the South reflected complex motives. Whatever factor weighed heaviest in their minds, many black men and women had simply had enough of the Old South. Charlie Patton, an American Delta bluesman born in 1891 in Mississippi to a former slave with African, Cherokee, and white ancestry, labored as a child on Dockery Plantation, which functioned as both a cotton farm and a sawmill. Dockery Plantation is a place that I went in Mississippi this September, and I'm going to embed some videos for you and some photographs of the cotton gin, the incredible cotton gin that was on the Dockery Plantation. It's located along the Sunflower River, outside of Cleveland, Mississippi, and it's absolutely crucial to American popular culture because so many blues residents, Charlie Patton, Robert Johnson, Howlin' Wolf, the patriarch of the Staple Singers, they all were born and raised and worked in this small concentration of talent, reinventing how to play guitar, how to sing, how to record music that explodes throughout the United States through the Great Migration. Charlie Patton died in Sunflower County, Mississippi in 1934, and he's arguably the most important American musician of the 20th century. He moaned with his blues guitar, "Every day seemed like murder down here. Every day seemed like murder down here. I'm going to leave tomorrow. I know you don't want me here." Faye Barnes, of no relation, sang of, quote, "Going north, child, where I can be free, where there's no hardship like in Tennessee." Cow Cow Davenport, a blues piano player, sang, quote, "I'm tired of this Jim Crow, gonna leave this Jim Crow town, doggone my black soul, I'm sweet Chicago bound." Blues mama Bessie Smith made it very clear in the 1920s in the South for black women was not the, quote, progressive era that white Americans and historians tend to remember for lavish parties, for flush times, and for legislative enlightenment. Quote, Mr. Rich Man, open up your heart and mind. Give the poor man a chance. Help stop these hard times." Between 1914 and 1918, the years that comprised World War I, some 400,000 black Americans migrated northward. In the 1920s, it was 800,000. In the Depression years, another 400,000. The census of 1910 indicated that black Americans were overwhelmingly rural and southern. Some 3 out of 4 black Americans lived in rural areas where their families had been re-enslaved in the nadir to sharecropping. 9 out of 10 black Americans lived in the South. Half a century later, by 1960, Black Americans were primarily urban, 75% lived in cities, and half of them lived outside of the old Southern slave states. These numbers show how the Great Migration completely redrew the racial landscape and the cultural landscape of the United States with one of the most significant mass movements of a people in the history of North America. The Great Migration transformed the daily experience of Black Americans and white Americans and how they came together in the ways they created, experienced, and consumed popular culture. So there were four major routes of Black migration from the South that developed. And so I want you to close your eyes and imagine how these routes tracked on a map. So first, one ran along the Atlantic seaboard towards New York. This is where most of the Harlem residents came from, and they often were coming from North and South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, and Alabama. The second route ran north from Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana, and it ended up in Chicago. The third main exodus artery out of the South developed later, especially during World War II, and this is the one that went west. It went from Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana to places like California, the Bay Area, Oakland, Los Angeles. The fourth, as I mentioned, went to Europe, primarily to London and to Paris. Practically all Black migrants settled in large cities. Between 1910 and 1920, Black populations mushroomed. 611% growth of Black migration populations in Cleveland, 308 in Chicago, 148% in Philadelphia, 59% in Indianapolis, 66% in New York City. So what had been small Black enclaves like Seneca Village that we've previously talked about, or Weeksville, suddenly became massive, separate Black belts. Physical movement, the right to physically move, to pursue happiness and rights, to liberty, to commerce, to life, remained for Black Americans the most psychologically dramatic of all manifestations post-slavery, to pursue freedom. Black culture and Black consciousness. So what emerged in the Chicago Black Belt, in Harlem and Detroit and in Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Oakland and in Los Angeles was not Black ghettos with their overcrowded housing, high crime rates, and unemployment that came to be the media stereotype. No. What truly emerged was a distinctive and historically significant Black culture and Black consciousness. From its religious institutions like the storefront churches that line the major streets in Harlem to various modes of perception and expression, the music, the humor, the slang, the fashion, and this new lifestyle. The culture heroes tended to be the preachers, the hustlers, and the entertainers. After World War I, New York City had its first ladies of the blues. Their recordings were played in almost every household and party in Harlem that owned a Victrola. The entertainers, the popular preachers like Father Divine, well, their records outsold all except the most important Black recording artists. They could convey feelings about matters of immediate concern to Black urban dwellers. More than the politicians and editors, recorded preachers and entertainers could stir a collective response in their audiences. They could remind them of their common identity as a people, and they could talk with them about their daily lives, about day-to-day problems of survival in this hostile society. What is so crucial about the urban experience in the history of Black America is that it became, in the 20th century, a kind of common denominator. Its lifestyle, the language, and the conditions provided a similarity of experience. And during the 1920s, Harlem became the capital of Black America, the center of several racially self-conscious movements, the home of the NAACP headquarters, the Garvey movement, and of course, the Harlem Renaissance. It was to Harlem that Black Americans looked for leadership, expert opinion, legal protection, and artistic expression. What was to become, for the sociologists, the pathology of Harlem, the, quote, cancer in the heart of the city, would become, for many Black Americans, the place to be, where they could begin to define their culture and their distinctiveness as a people.